And welcome everybody. And we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation, and I'll go through the slides. Um, and certainly, as I mentioned, if you do have any questions, please put those in the chat and we'll address them as they come up. Just as a quick review of where things are at with TABE 11 and 12, obviously it's a new test and it's aligned to the new College and Career Readiness Standards. And most of you are aware that it's just offered in one length. There's not a survey or a complete battery like there was with TABE 9 and 10. And that has more of a foundation in the standards and how many standards there are and the content to be covered to get through the federal approval. And we'll talk about that as well a little bit longer as we move on. And also the content areas of the test being reading, math, and language. Anybody that's familiar with TABE 9 and 10 knew that there was a spelling, a language mechanics, and a vocabulary test that was not very rarely used. But we'll talk about some areas within those content areas that maybe now are incorporated into the language test as we move on. And at the end, we'll talk about some research studies that we have underway that relate TABE to other assessments, mainly for college placement or for high school equivalency. So we'll talk about that as we move forward as well. As a review, TABE 9 and 10 is still actually available, but not federally approved. We haven't set an official retirement date for TABE 9 and 10 yet, but if you're using it for WIOA reporting, that ended on June 30th. It can no longer be used for federal accountability tracking. We probably will have an official retirement date sometime next year, maybe coinciding with the program year. We're not sure yet, but that will be announced in the future. TABE 11 and 12 is fully approved for federal reporting. We're the only assessment. We're very proud that we're the only assessment to have the full federal approval for all content areas of reading, math, and language for the full 7 years. So we're happy to have that approval and gone through that rigorous process. I won't touch on TABE Class E too much today. We could certainly have a follow-up webinar as things progress, but TABE Class E is our assessment for ESL students, and I know there are some programs that use that in Texas. Just as a reminder, we are going to move TABE Class E to have additional support through our computer-based platform. We're not getting rid of the paper version, but we're going to add support in February of 2020 for TABE Class E. And also the federal approval process for ESL assessments. All ESL assessments that are currently approved, they all end on the same date of June 30th, 2021. And so there are new federal approval processes underway for all ESL assessments. Just know that similar to how TABE changed back in 2018 for 11 and 12, TABE Class E is going to have a revision. We are actually going to have more of a minor revision for TABE Class E because we're just updating some of the content, the test questions. Not much of the objectives are changing for TABE Class E, so you should not see a big change there. But certainly adding the support for anybody that's using TABE Online to have Class E Online is something that is being looked forward to. Where TABE is used for accountability purposes, it's used in 45 states across the country, Texas certainly being one of them. Some of the states, like Texas, have other tests that are approved for use. Some states are exclusive for TABE, but 45 out of the 50 states use it for their federal accountability purposes. How it's being used also depends on what program you're with. The majority of programs are in the top left corner under the WIOA-funded adult ed program, and that's, I think, the majority certainly within Texas Workforce Commission-funded programs, using TABE as their accountability assessment. But TABE is also used in many other areas. On the top right side of the diagram, workforce screening and placement. The example I use is if you want to work on a dairy farm in Pennsylvania, there's one that uses TABE as a hiring assessment for that. There's a trucking company in Tampa, Florida that uses TABE as a hiring tool. If you want to go into the police academy in Oklahoma to go into the state police academy, they have a TABE requirement as well. And then if you're moving to Kentucky and you want to work for Jim Beam at the distillery, they have many jobs within the distillery that require a TABE score as an application process for that. So certainly a lot of workplace scenarios for TABE. On the bottom left-hand corner, the correctional education. In many states, correctional ed is part of the WIOA funded. In some states, it's not. I know within Texas, within the Windham School District, They're not part of the Texas workforce always in all the policies, but certainly they use TABE in all their functions as well. And then the bottom right-hand corner is for high school equivalency. There are we're doing some concordance studies, and we'll talk about them at the end. We're aligning TABE to high school equivalency, specifically for reading and math. And then at the very bottom, using TABE as a college placement tool. Many states that have community colleges within their adult ed programs, like Wisconsin, Illinois, Louisiana, Alabama, and others, they allow TABE scores to be used for placement purposes, eliminating the need for additional testing with college placement tests like AccuPlacer, or in Louisiana, even with the ACT. So we're refreshing some of that, and I'll have some more information as we move forward. One of the updates that we had back at our COABE conference in the spring was that we announced a partnership with a company called Literacy Pro Systems, and they have a product called LACIS, which is a database system. In Texas, you guys use Teams, so that's not, LACIS may not be familiar to everybody. But what this partnership has allowed us to do is to start integrating data within data systems. So in states that use LACIS, we are now sending data files on a nightly basis to the LACIS system to eliminate the hand entering of TABE scores into the data system. This started with LACIS and with the Literacy Pro Systems because they have contracts in about 20 states, so it was easy to touch 20 states at once. But we have gone back and started to work with states that have proprietary data systems like Texas. We've started already with Michigan and Alabama to start exchanging data within those programs. So we are going to continue to work on that and include other states, and certainly Texas is one of them. We would like to start integrating data within the TABE system over to Teams so that you can eliminate the hand entering of data for those purposes. One of the big points for TABE 11 and 12 is a lot of new resources that are available. And we try to post all the available resources to our website, which is tabetest.com. And I will go ahead and show some of those resources to you. I'll go through that. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to our website itself. So let me jump over there real quick. And you should see our tabetest.com website pop up on the screen. Across the top of the website are several menu bars that have drop-down menus below them. And I'm going to focus today just on the Resources tab that's in the top right side of the screen. Under Resources, there's a TABE 11 and 12 section, and you'll notice a lot of resources that are posted within there. We'll come back to the first one, the TABE and Task Concordance Study. There's a linking there to a report that shows a side-by-side comparison of all approved assessments, TABE 11 and 12 and other assessments. But I'm going to go down to the middle of the screen and click on our TABE 11 and 12 blueprints as our first resource. The TABE 11 and 12 blueprints are available for every level of TABE and every content area of TABE. And I'll open up the Math Level A blueprint first. And this blueprint starts out with a pie chart. The pie chart is made up of the sections of the College and Career Readiness Standards that are incorporated within that level of TABE. So for Level A of TABE Math, there are 5 sections of the College and Career Readiness Standards that are covered. They're numbers and quantity, algebra, functions, geometry, statistics, and probability. At a very high level, I could look at this blueprint and say, well, over 50% of the test covers algebra and functions. So that's a starting point if I'm a teacher to understand what's on Level A of TABE. But I can then scroll down on this blueprint and look at the color coding of the pie chart, and that first color that comes up is the gold area for geometry. And now within geometry, I see the subdomains or subskills that are covered within geometry. The left-hand side of the screen has the numbering sequence for the College and Career Readiness Standard, so not everybody has that memorized and they're not too important. But the middle has the description for the subdomain. In the first one, it says no precise definition of angle, circle, perpendicular line, parallel line, and line segments. And we follow that to the far right and see that that is a low emphasis. Low emphasis on Level A of TABE because that's the blueprint that I'm within. And this is a low emphasis because the key words that start off this description, no precise definition. Knowing a definition is more of an introductory or intermediate skill, so something that would not be covered that heavily on level A of TABE for math. So a low emphasis means that it could be covered, but at a very low occurrence for that. Looking at the third one down, we see it says use volume formulas for cylinders, pyramids, cones, and spheres to solve problems, and that's a high emphasis. That is a targeted skill for level A. So high emphasis means much more questions on the test related to that subdomain. So again, as a teacher, if I'm teaching math to a multi-level class, it would be very beneficial to have all the blueprints together, because I would likely see both of these same descriptors. If I open up the level D blueprint, knowing the precise definition would still be a descriptor for level D, but it would be at a higher emphasis than low. It would probably be medium, maybe even high. And on the other side, using the volume formulas for cylinders, pyramids, and cones would not be a high emphasis on a lower level of TABE. It would be more of an introductory skill, so something covered at less emphasis. So again, I can start to see where concepts are being introduced and where they're being covered at a high emphasis by comparing the different levels of the blueprints all together. I'm going to jump back to the website and go through another resource. And up at the top under the resource tab, under TABE 11 and 12, the next one I'm going to click on is our practice items. And the practice items, let me get there really quick if I can control my mouse. The practice items are sample practice tests that are printable PDF files for all levels of TABE for each content area. And so I will open up the first one, the level M practice test. And the first thing that we see with level M is a new type of question for TABE 11 and 12. No longer are just the questions all multiple choice. Part of the requirements from the U.S. Department of Ed for the NRS approval is to have a higher level of depth of knowledge related to the content that's being assessed. And you do that with new types of questions. Traditional multiple choice questions typically are only level 1 and level 2 of depth of knowledge. So having new types of questions allow us to reach level 3 depth of knowledge coverage. And this first question is a gridded response math question. So it says 10 plus x divided by 2, and it asks you to evaluate x equaling 4. So 10 plus 4 divided by 2, the answer is 12. And on the paper and pencil test, I can grid in the bubble of 1 and 2 for the 12. This gridded response is a student that is providing the answer. They are not selecting the answer. So it takes away from that selected response, which was a multiple choice question. And that multiple choice may have been 8, 10, 12, and 14, and that student would select the right answer. Here, they have to demonstrate that they can provide the answer and not just select it from a list. If I'm using TABE Online, this question is a fill-in-the-blank question. So the student is provided a box, and they would type in the 1, 2 for the math question. If I scroll all the way to the end of the practice test, you'll notice that there is an answer key at the end of the test. So if you do want to print these sample test items out, you want to make sure to remove the answer key if you're sharing this with students. I'm going to jump back to the resource tab and open up the level A reading sample test this time. And level A of reading starts out with a passage that is about buying local. And as we go through the passage, we find out that it's a 6-paragraph passage. The last paragraph is just 1 sentence long, so it's a short paragraph. But it starts out with a traditional multiple choice or selected response question. It asks you to read the sentence from paragraph 4, and then it says which key idea does the sentence support? And you can answer that with a traditional multiple choice question. If we go down a little bit farther to question number 3, we'll notice that there's a new type of question again for reading, and this is a evidence-based selected response, which is a fancy way of saying a 2-part question. So question number 3 has a part A. It says, how does the author provide effective support for the main idea of the article? And that is a multiple choice question. But there is a part B that says, which detail from the article best supports the answer to part A? So you're providing the evidence to support your answer to the first part. This is a 2-part question that is worth 2 points. And if you get both A and B correct, you get 2 points for that question. If you get A correct but B incorrect, you can get 1 point. If you get A incorrect and B correct, you get 0 points. You can't get credit for getting the evidence when you have the wrong main idea. So it's 0, 1, or 2 points that are awarded for the evidence-based selected response. With these 2-point questions, they are used on all levels of TABE. There's a few of them, 3 of them on level E, but there's 15 of them on level A, so much more rigorous content coverage at level A than level E for TABE. If we scroll down a little farther to the level A question number 6, we see an evidence-based selected response, part A and part B. It says which statement represents a claim made by the author in paragraph 5. But then part B says which 2 details from the article best support the answer to part A. So now it's asking for a multiple select response. So you select 2 answers. If this was TABE Online, this passage, A, B, C, and D combined, would be a paragraph, and you would be clicking on the sentences within the paragraph. So it is a technology-enabled question because you're actively clicking within the test question. Again, new types of questions that are used within the reading test as well. Under the resource tab again, I'm going to go back up to the resource tab and look at table 11 and 12 again, and we'll go through a couple of other resources that are available. If you are using TABE Online, there is a quick start guide that's posted there for you to help out anybody that might need some help on using TABE Online. The Quick Start Guide is a summary of the 100+ page user guide for TABE Online, and it's organized in steps for different commonly used tasks. So in the middle of the screen, I see if I want to set up a test session, here are the steps to follow to set up a test session. And I can do that very easily by following those steps. If I'm not into reading, because not everybody likes to read, we can go back to the resource tab. And instead of going to the Quick Start Guide, just a couple below that, there's a TABE Online training videos. And these are resources for programs, again, using TABE Online that want to watch this Quick Start Guide instead of using it through the reading steps. And in the middle of the screen, we can see that there's a short video on TABE Online test session management, which would cover those same steps that we saw on the Quick Start Guide. So a number of different free training resources that are available for you to go through, whether using TABE Online or for paper and pencil resources. There's also a certification model under the TABE 11 and 12 resource tab. In the bottom half of the screen, there is a TABE 11 and 12 certification process. If we open up that certification process, it has some instruction, and in the middle of the screen, there are 2 recorded webinars, part 1 and part 2. If you watch both of those webinars, there's a short quiz at the end of both of them. If you get 80% or better on the quiz, it will automatically print you a certificate to be a TABE administrator. So that's another free resource for training related to TABE 11 and 12. A couple of other points on the webinar is that in the middle, instead of clicking on the TABE 11 and 12 resource tab, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom, and we have the online tools training. This online tools training is a resource for TABE Online as a tutorial, and it will allow students or teachers to understand the student experience from TABE Online. And it allows you to go ahead and click into this, and you can start taking tutorials related to TABE 11 and 12 reading, math, and language. They are sorted by the levels, and if I go back into level A for reading, I can do an audio version or a standard where the student reads the screen. And I'll open this up real quick just to show you this in a couple of pages here. So the username and password to use is right above the box that you're required to enter that in there. So I'll type that in there real quick. And when I go into the tutorial, now I'm going through the system as a student. So the student is welcomed into the testing screen. They're told, what their ID number was if it was assigned. They're asked to continue. And the difference between paper and pencil testing and computer-based testing is that now the student will work themselves through the test directions. So they're told what tests they've been assigned in a traditional TABE that might be reading, math, and language listed here, but this is the tutorial just for the reading. So we can click on that link, and it will start the directions on how to use this tutorial. And they're being told that there's a help button on the screen, and they can go ahead and to the next screen. They're told that there'll be a pointer to use and a flag button to use, and that will help them go through that. And I'll click through these navigation ones really quickly just to get to the student experience. The last screen is 3 circles that indicate your computer is operating correctly, and you can begin the test. What I wanted to show you is that this level A reading tutorial is that same passage we saw in the PDF version of Buying Local. So there's the 6-paragraph passage that we just saw earlier, and that first question about reading sentence 4 from the paragraph, and I can select that answer. If I move to the next question, I'm going to skip that question number 2 and go right to question 3, which, if you remember, was a 2-part question, the evidence-based selected response. So part A is the first question, and part B is the second question. And then I'll go ahead down on the bottom and click the green review button, and it allows me to jump even further to question number 6 that we saw earlier, which was another 2-part question. And that second part that I mentioned was going to be the paragraph. So here's, if you remember, we just showed you each sentence was a multiple choice item, but now each sentence is selectable. And if I tried to select the third sentence, it will bring up a warning that I've gone past the maximum of 2 because the directions were to which 2 details. So again, just a quick demonstration of how that works with the multiple select within the TABE Online environment. TABE Online also has the tools that will allow us to use the highlighter. So we have the highlighter there. We can turn the highlighter off. You can make a sticky note if you wanted to post a sticky note in the page there and make a note of something. So that's available, and you can drag that around. We can blow up the screen with a magnifying glass if we need to look at a diagram. If your student prefers to read with a straight edge, we have a line guide that allows you to use the straight edge to read that. If this was a math test and you were on the calculator portion, there would be a calculator icon next to that. And as of Thursday, there will be a formula icon next to the calculator icon for the math test as well. So starting on Thursday for TABE Online, there'll be a formula guide there that students can use for the formulas. That formula will also be a printed PDF that will be posted to the website also for paper and pencil testers as well. I won't go through all the other features of TABE Online, just to know that you can go down to the bottom. If you wanted to change the color and font, you can do that. You can flag a question for follow-up, different resources. And if we go back to that review button, we can see that the flag shows up on our review screen. We can show that we've skipped a couple of questions, we've answered a couple of questions, and we can either return to the test or we can end the test. And I'll go ahead and end this test. But just be aware that this is available again under the TABE 11 and 12 resource tab. And you can go ahead and use that at any time to show your students the experience or to look at what the students see from your own side of things.
Hi, Mike. This is Tracy. We have a couple of questions in this pod. So one is from Crystal. She's asking, is the TABE 11 and 12 certification process online that you were showing a minute ago, are they 6 hours?
No, they're 2 90-minute
right.
videos.
Okay.
So that would be 3 hours.
And so in Texas, in our assessment guide, there has been this requirement that a new teacher must obtain 6 hours of TABE 11-12 training, which is why Jan created the TABE training, the Texas-style TABE training.
Correct.
And so, Crystal, that is still applicable. I think that a refresher for TABE 11-12 can be 3 hours. And so does that answer your question, Crystal? I know it would be nice to have 3 hours for our state, but right now it is still 6. So we have another question from Tiffany. What levels is the calculator tool icon?
So for the calculator for TABE, calculator is used on level M, D, and A. For level M, it is a a four-function calculator. For levels D and A, it's the scientific calculator that's used for high school equivalency tests for that. And I will
Good
point that out.
question, Tiffany.
And there's also on the resource tab, there is a reference sheet for the calculator that allows you to have some resources. There's a tutorial and download on the practice sheet for the calculator, and then also a link to some of the other vendors that offer the scientific non-programmable calculators. I believe most programs use the TI-30XS, and there's a link there for what Texas Instruments provides. But Casio makes a couple of versions that do the same thing, and I believe there's an HP one that's listed as an option for TABE.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Let's see. Can you put some of these resource links in the chat pod? Anne Marie, are you asking me or Mike?
Whoever would like to, because I'm wondering if that way people could grab them and bookmark
Okay.
for the calculator.
Got it. Okay. Let me see if I can figure that out. And if y'all have any questions, we've had a great couple of questions. Please put them in the chat pod, and Mike will be happy to answer them. Oops. Okay. Here we go. Zanelle's asking, since the updated Table 11-12 assessment times rolled out, is there a breakdown of how much time is given for Part 1 and 2 of each subject?
Yes, and I'll cover that here shortly. I'm going to jump back to our PowerPoint, and we'll address that as we move forward.
Great. Thank you. Tiffany, thank you for putting the certification process down. Now, that, again, doesn't apply to Texas. I will say that. And the calculator, Tiffany, wonderful. Thank you. We've got a helper in Tiffany Lee. Thank you.
So
Okay,
one of the resources that I didn't click on back on the resource tab is that we do have a best practice webinar series that we try to do on the third Thursdays of every month, and they are recorded and posted to the resource tab. So they go back. We started in December, and we've been doing them every month. There's topics on TABE Online. There's topics on scanning answer sheets. We had our content team come in and do a webinar on how the standards become test questions. We had one related to curriculum providers and what content was available, and we had Jeff Loomis from Crowded Learning talk about the free resources that are available through Crowded Learning from his organization as a not-for-profit group that kind of combines resources that are available. And so you can go to the tabetest.com and go through those recorded webinars. They're about 45 minutes long, so they're fairly short. You can also sign up for any future notices if you're not getting invitations to the webinars. There's a link there to sign up for that as well. One of the big changes related to the standard is the change for the National Reporting System, or the U.S. Department of Ed's accountability requirements for adult education. And on this screen, I have an example. This is the level 1 math descriptor for the National Reporting System that is measured to show measurable skills gains. And for TABE 9 and 10, the descriptor from the Department of Ed was the blue box on the top. It was very straightforward and fairly simple, just one sentence that said an individual has little or no recognition of numbers or simple counting skills, or may only have minimal skills such as the ability to add or subtract single-digit numbers. And if you mastered that with level E of TABE 9 and 10, you were able to demonstrate that measurable skills gain and move forward with that student. Under the new guidelines from the Department of Education, they released new descriptors, and that's the orange box on the bottom. And this is what we need to be measuring with TABE 11 and 12 to receive our federal approval. And you can see that it's 5 paragraphs long. But paragraph 3 in the middle says algebraic thinking. Students prepared to exit this level understand and apply the properties of operation to addition and subtraction problems. So it kind of says the same thing up above, but those key words of understanding and applying it, and how do we measure that and track that? And that goes along with some of the other words in red that I highlighted. Explain their reasoning, organize, represent, and interpret, analyze, and compare. And again, remember, this is the level 1 math descriptor. So we've certainly seen a change in TABE 11 and 12. The content is more rigorous, and this is the foundation of where that change came from. This is also the difference between high school equivalency and assessments that are used for accountability tracking. All the high school equivalency tests align to the same college and career readiness standards, but there is no federal oversight for high school equivalency, so they are not required to align to these NRS level descriptors that the accountability assessments are required. So if a program will say, well, my students are passing the high school equivalency test at level 4 of the NRS, and that could be, but the goal of the NRS system and the change that they made to these new descriptors is to take a student beyond passing a high school equivalency test and to be able then to have the skills required to succeed at the next level. And that next level could be a post-secondary program, it could be a workforce program, it could be a career program, but what the administration at the time within the Department of Ed wanted was that a student exiting adult ed, and that's different than leaving early to take their high school equivalency, but a student that exited adult ed, meaning they went through NRS levels 5 and 6, was in the best possible position to succeed immediately at their next step. I think the challenge that a lot of post-secondary programs see are even with high school students that get through high school at a minimal level, or students that pass their high school equivalency test, they're doing so at the minimal criteria, which, you know, again, if you think about that in real world terms, you can get D's and C's in high school and still get a diploma. But are you ready for the rigors of what a post-secondary curriculum might entail? And a lot of times, when you go to enroll, you'll take a reading and math placement test and be placed in those non-100 level, so the 0980 class, or sometimes there's 0500 or 050 classes. They're dev ed classes that are not for credit, but they still do cost tuition dollars. So a student might have to use financial aid to spend on a non-credit bearing class. And that's what the Department of Ed was trying to get away from. For students to then move to the next step, whether it's career technical, post-secondary, or workforce, and not be ready to succeed. And that's, you know, again, when programs are saying that TABE is much more rigorous than the high school equivalency test. I think at the higher levels of TABE that it is, because that's the descriptors that the Department of Ed has put forth and what they were trying to do with the descriptors. So I think there's a big change in how accountability assessments now follow these NRS descriptors.
Hey, Mike, we have a question. So a program, Crystal is asking about how is the best way to set up progress test sessions. They're doing TABE online. She has created a session for a student for each level, like reading level A, reading level M is another test session.
I think right now the progress testing within TABE online is an area that we're looking at to try to improve that process. Ideally, what I would like to have in the system is that you can edit a test session and put two students with different levels in that same session. And we've started a little bit of that because we've introduced a next recommended TABE test indicator for within the online system. So you might start seeing that tilde sign, which is normally on your keyboard up by the number 1, show up when you try to register a student for a session that they might have already been in. And so we had a webinar related to that on our monthly webinars that might be useful to review for that. But we are working on trying to come up with ways. I think the way that you described of having possible scenarios. So you might have a session that is level M for reading, but also level M for math as a possible progress test. But you could also have another session that's level M for reading and level D for math for any student that might need those combination of those two. And I know that will end up creating a lot of sessions, which the system will support. And we're in the process of cleaning out some of the old 910 sessions, so you'll see those go away in the near future. But having the ability to edit a session, I think, is the ultimate goal, and it's something that we're working on.
Okay, thank you. And if anyone out in the field has any thoughts for Crystal, please feel free to put them in the chat pod. Thank you, Mike.
So talking about testing times, and it was mentioned that we have reduced our testing times about a month or so ago. That was our second reduction. We reduced them back in 2018 as well. And we've done that after monitoring the results of about 2.5 million students taking the different sections of TABE. And I don't think we're going to reduce our times anymore. We see the times listed on the screen, 50 minutes per section for reading. That is down from 60 minutes per section. 55 minutes for language, that's down from 60 minutes. And 65 minutes for math, and that's down from 75 minutes. Both reading and math have part 1 and part 2, except for level E of math. There is no calculator portion for math. So part 2 of math is always the calculator section. One important point or a best practice to remember is that you do need to do both parts, reading and math, to get a score, but you don't have to do both parts immediately right after each other. And that, certainly can come into a helpful area if you're limited on time. A lot of times this happens in correctional programs or programs that are more regimented on their time and less flexible. But if you only have an hour to work with students this morning, you can give them part 1 of the reading test. When you give part 2, maybe it's tomorrow when you have another hour that's available. Maybe it's Friday when you have another time slot available. The important part to remember is if you're doing a separation between part 1 and part 2, is that you don't want to assign any instructional homework on reading. So I don't want to give you a reading book and assign you a topic on that book in between the reading test, because I'm still measuring you on your reading standards. So it is okay and permissible to break apart the sections if need be, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move forward as well. Looking at the averages for the time, and here's I added a column for averages, so 100 minutes for reading when they're combined, but the average student is taking between 75 and 80 minutes. For math, 55 is the allowable time, but the average student takes between 35 and 40 minutes. And then for math, 65 is the total, and the average student is between 40 and 45 minutes for math. Again, these averages are over the nation of programs, so that includes correctional ed and adult ed programs and workforce programs. So your students may be, above average or below average or right at the average as well for that. Looking at our Insight platform, we've already seen the Insight test engine for the student side of TABE Online, but if you're interested in TABE Online, it does run on any operating system, whether it's Windows, Macs, or iPads or Chromebooks, so you can use that for anything. And as I mentioned earlier, we use this for TABE and TASK today, and we'll be adding TABE Class E early next year. But we also use the same Insight platform to host our scanning system for TABE 11 and 12. So if any program is using paper and pencil and is hand scoring their answer sheets, I would encourage you to look at our scanning system. We made some significant changes for scanning from 9 and 10. In TABE 9 and 10, it required our TestMate software that was about $3,500. It required a Scantron scanner that was typically $4,000 to $6,000. And Scantron would try to have you sign up for a maintenance plan that would be $1,000 a year. So scanning TABE 9 and 10 answer sheets was an expensive process if you were a small to medium-sized program. For TABE 11 and 12, we did away with the software requirements and the same in the Scantron scanners, and we moved to a web-based system using our Insight platform. So today you can use an image-based scanner, and there's a few of them listed here. There are actually hundreds of scanners that will work, but this Epson 200, the very first one on the list, retails on some office supply stores for about $198. So it's very affordable compared to the staff time that it would take to hand score TABE 11 and 12 answer sheets with those 2-point questions, with the multiple select questions, sorting out the unscored questions. So certainly a labor-intensive process for hand scoring paper and pencil. You may already have a scanner that you use for other document capturing, and it may work for TABE. The only requirements we have is that your scanner is a dual read scanner, a continuous feed scanner, and also Twain compliant. Dual read means that it reads both sides of the page at the same time. Continuous feed means that it has a tray to put the answer sheets on. It's not a flatbed scanner that some people have at their house that it normally has a big glass top on it for putting the documents on. And Twain compliant just means that it connects to the internet. If you have the scanner connected to your computer and your computer is connected to the internet, the scanner will automatically connect to our portal so that anything that is scanned goes directly into the portal, and you don't have to attach it, you don't have to email it to us, it's just a direct connection, and that's what the Twain compliant piece does. If you happen to have a scanner and you want to see if it will work, it's best just to type the model number into Google and go through the specification sheet for that scanner, and if you see the word Twain, it will generally work for TABE 11 and 12. And there is no fees required to scan. You just have to use the TABE 11 and 12 answer sheets, and they then are scannable at no additional charge for that. One big benefit of the scanning is that also the data goes into the same database for where TABE Online data goes. So as we start talking about sharing data with teams, any scan data or TABE Online data would automatically be able to be transferred in when we start that process.
Okay, Mike, we have a couple of questions
Sure.
here, or comments. So when a student tests out of range, what is your recommendation for how to handle that? We have in our assessment policy a certain amount of days or a time frame within to give all the tests. And but this is a really good question. When would you recommend retesting that test?
Yeah, I think, and we'll talk more about out of range on a handout that we have coming up. But I think the time frame certainly you have to fit within the state policy for that. But I would encourage that there is some sort of a break for that, so that there is not, you know, somebody that has just tested reading, math, and language, and let's say the language is out of range, I wouldn't immediately set them down for another fourth test. I think that certainly is too much. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that screen.
Okay, and then Tiffany is offering a suggestion. I'm not sure, Tiffany, exactly what you mean, but you're talking about labeling test sessions with the auto locator, so it's like a year semester session.
Yeah, and I think what Tiffany is talking about is the name of the test session, which is a good point, because you're allowed to name the test session, and if you don't name it, it just defaults to TABE 11 or TABE 12, and it becomes very nondescript. But I think if you name it, and you know, again, that's a naming convention that's probably specific to Tiffany's program, but it could be just TABE 11 pre-test with auto locator. That would be a name, or TABE progress test, TABE 11D math and reading M. So it helps to put the name your session, what that occurrence is happening for that.
Okay, great tip there, Tiffany. Thank you. And then there's a couple more. Let's see. Zanella is saying online scanning is great. It's accurate and provides assessment analysis. And then Tiffany's asking, are we eventually able to archive test sessions each year? Will you be able to archive them?
Yeah, so we will be cleaning up the system, but when we archive automatically all TABE 9 and 10 data, that will clean up the screens, and then we are working on future enhancements for archiving that will probably be driven off of the date range of the test session. So you set a session up for this quarter or this month or this year, and it would be visible for that time frame. And after that time frame passes, it would move to an archive status. And so those are the developments that are happening, you know, kind of to help organize the screen a little bit more within TABE Online.
Okay. And Sarah is asking, what's the recommended student limit for test sessions? Sessions that get over 50 tickets, or students tend to not load or load extremely slowly?
You can have as many test sessions as possible, or as needed, but the general recommendation from our support team is to have between 50 and 60 students at a maximum. So again, if you're a smaller program and you only service, let's say, 50 students every year, then your test session can be open for a whole year. But if you have 50 students every week or every month, then you would have new test sessions for those time frames, because we want to keep it right around that 50 number. We are trying to figure that out. We actually added more hardware to increase the capacity of the system, but it didn't fix that issue of slowing the system down when you have, let's say, 75 or 100 or 200 students in a test session. So our technology team is still looking into why that slows down and why the additional hardware didn't fix that. So that is something that is also being worked on.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about our TABE reports a little bit, and the TABE reports are available, again, for anybody using TABE Online or the scanning system. You have access to the same reports, and the majority of programs will use the individual profile the most, and we'll go through that in detail on the next screen. But you also have access to an individual portfolio report. The portfolio is a summary of a student's performance over time. So if I tested in January, in July, and in October, I could run a portfolio report and get a summary of all three of those testing occurrences. I also can run a locator report if I want to see how the locator was separating out my level assignments between EM, D, and A. So you can pull up the locator report. That bulk export is the one that we talked about putting into the state data system. So that's kind of a state level option. And then we also have a roster option for a report. If I want to look at a group of students today, let's say everybody on this call, I'm assuming it's around 75, we're testing today, and I'll shorten that so that we're in compliance. Let's say there's 50 people in the test session today. I can run the roster report and get a summary of every student on one report, very much like the portfolio report above, but not individual based. It would have Mike Johnson listed, then it would have Tracy listed, then it had Anne-Marie listed, and our summaries all in the same report. So you just get a summary and not the diagnostics. You also have the ability to have an export file on your own, and it can export right out to Excel. So if you want to sort your data in a different way, you have the ability to do that with the local exporting option. We call that the on-demand extract that's listed in the report side of the testing platform. As I mentioned, most of you use the individual profile, and we have had a couple of updates that have happened already. Phase 1 and 2 are both released. We're still working on Phase 3. Phase 1 added the red box on the bottom of the screen. This report is an individual profile for a sample student, and they took TABE 11 up on the top. We can see they took TABE 11 over 2 different days, and they took level M for everything. And then we see the point values on the top of the screen. Again, we no longer look at number correct. We look at number of points obtained out of the total number of points. So there was 47 points on the reading test, and I obtained 44 of those points. And then we see my scale score, my standard error measurement, and my NRS level. Another box that was added is our measurable skills gain column on the far right. And that could either be a Y for yes or an N for no. The important point on the measurable skills gain column is that it starts on July 1st and goes till June 30th. So if this sample student took reading previously since July, and this is a bad example because these are older reports, but if I took a reading test in July and I took another one in October, I went from an NRS level 3 in July to an NRS level 4 in October, and that's why it shows a yes on the screen. So it's just a visual indicator to show that this program year, the student has made a gain over from their testing. So most notably on your progress test, you want to see if that has changed from a yes to a no. At the bottom of the screen in the red box, we added the point values for each of the domain areas. So the left-hand side of the bottom of the screen, under reading, we see key ideas and details, craft and structure, and integration of knowledge and ideas. Those would be the pie charts from the blueprint for the reading blueprint for level M of TABE. And so the left-hand side is always the same as the blueprint that we showed earlier. And it tells us how many questions there were. We can see there were 18 questions and 18 points, but then the next one is 17 questions and 20 points. So 3 of them were 2-point questions. The biggest change is that on the second page, we've added now additional skills for the student. Again, we start on the left-hand side with the blueprint and the pie charts, the key ideas and details, craft and structure. But now we've broken out the columns into our demonstrated skills and our areas of next focus. So this could loosely be saying our strengths and our weaknesses. but our research scientists want to use some fancy words, so we use demonstrated skills and areas of next focus. A key point here to notice is that I was proficient on key ideas and details from the previous report on the previous page. If I go back to that, you notice that I was proficient in all the reading areas at level M. So on the second page, my areas of next focus are actually the skills for level D. So this is the next area to work up on for that. So now I have the areas on the next highest level. Since I'm proficient on this level, which was M, I'm being shown the skills for level D on that. This is a new report that launched about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago or so. If you have had a student that tested before the update, you can go back and rerun the report. It will repopulate with this new information. So that works for both scanning and TABE Online programs that have students. You can get this data for that. I'm going to jump back to our PowerPoint real quick. I'm sorry, jump back to the website real quick and move away from the PowerPoint and go back to our resource tab and cover a couple of other resources. At the resource tab under TABE 11 and 12, near the bottom of the resource list is a scoring best practice white paper or guideline. If we open up that scoring best practice, there's a couple of charts, and I'll blow up the size of these charts to be a little easier to read. One thing you'll notice on TABE 11 and 12, different from TABE 9 and 10, is that our scale has changed. The scale for TABE 11 and 12 goes from 300 to 800. Those are proprietary numbers, so it doesn't relate to any other assessment. But TABE 9 and 10, they went from 100 to 900, just for reference. But a bigger change for TABE 11 and 12 is that we segmented the scale across the levels for the NRS and the levels of TABE. So the easiest way to kind of recall that in TABE 9 and 10, if a student did very well on level E, they would get a very high scale score and they would be placed, I believe it was in level 5 of the NRS. Now we would technically call that out of range, and we were kind of enforcing that 2 grade levels above the content area, but the system was not stopping that. And so for TABE 11 and 12, we have now segmented the ranges out for the scale scores, and you can see on level E, a student can only get up to NRS level 3 if they do very well, so they will cap out on there. What this says is that there is no out of range on the high side for TABE 11 and 12. We'll talk about the low side here on the second page. As I scroll down to the second page of this white paper, we also are introduced to new references related to scale score. And we see here this student took reading, level D. There was 50 points on the test. The student obtained 16 of them. So they didn't do that great. And they have a 501 minus as their scale score. The minus sign is the new indicator, and it is just a visual indicator that lets the teacher or an administrator know that this student did poorly on the test, but they were not out of range. But in order to show NRS growth, they were measured at NRS level 3. So to get to an NRS level 4, this student is going to have to jump the whole way through NRS level 3. And it's just a way of saying, if I see a minus sign, generally that student is going to benefit from full instruction, maybe from some blended learning with some online tools, but they are probably not going to be considered a fast-track student that just needs a refresher on a couple of points, because they were at the very bottom of this NRS level, and the minus sign just means that they're going to need to make a big step to show an improvement. On the other side, we can see the math test was 37 points, and the student got 35, so they did very well, and they get the plus sign next to the scale score. The plus sign simply means that there is no more growth available on this level of TABE for this student. So if my goal is to raise this student from an NRS level 5 to a 6, I have to move to level A of TABE to be able to get to that NRS level 6. So you may see a plus sign at level E. That means you have to move up to level M to get to show growth, because that student reached the ceiling score for that level of TABE. So again, both scores are recordable, but they just have some visual indicators next to them to make people aware of things that they may not have memorized yet, like they did in TABE 9 and 10. The last one, the language test, you can see the student, there was 40 points on the test. The student got 10 points, so they did pretty poorly, and they did not register a high enough score on points to get an actual scale score. So this student was out of range for reporting purposes. And this student's language test is out of range. The student still does have 2 recordable scores. Reading and math are both recordable, but the language score is out of range. Couple of things to note here, if we just look at it at a very high level, they took all 3 tests on the same day. And I know a lot of programs in Texas were experiencing this at the beginning, that students were having test fatigue because it's the last test that is out of range. So they were getting, just frustrated with the test or the day. And so it is a best practice to break up this testing time, whether it's over 2 days or morning and afternoon, but again, separating them out instead of just one occurrence or one sitting for the test. If this was a student that had 11 points instead of 10 points, they would have had a minus sign, for example, on this one, just to show how close that student was to having an in-range score. So again, this student could be re-registered for another language test. Let's assume this was 11, they would take 12, and then hopefully have a recordable score for that. Again, that was a white paper that's posted at tabetest.com under the resource tab at the very bottom, which was the scoring best practice. The next resource that I'm going to pull up is our scale, score, and grade range white paper. And this white paper is, again, in the middle of the resources tab. It will talk about grade ranges. You would notice that when we looked at the sample report, there was not a grade equivalent on the report. And there is a difference between a grade range and a grade equivalent. A grade equivalent is something that TABE 9 and 10 used, but it was a very fuzzy score. And fuzzy is a high-level psychometric word that maybe not everybody understands, but it just means that it's fuzzy. And when something is not statistically valid, our research team does not put that on the report. So when the scale score is a valid score, the grade equivalent is always open to interpretation, so that is not a score they no longer put on the report. I was always kind of advocating that we need to have some reference to that because a lot of programs still use it as a guide. So this is the chart that we have as a tool. It looks at the 6 levels of the NRS on the left side. The middle column is how the NRS breaks out the grade ranges across those 6 levels. And you can always kind of see the middle is always where the bigger area is. So a lot of people get stuck in the middle area because it's covering 3 grades on content. And then we put the K through 12 grades listed there, and then the corresponding range of scale scores. And again, it does not matter what level of TABE, because remember from the first chart that we saw, you can only get to a 576 on certain levels of TABE. So between a 576 and a 596 would be considered the 9th grade range. But the important thing is to remember, how is that considered? And it's considered when we relate it back to the college and career readiness standards from the U.S. Department of Education. Not related to TABE 9 and 10, 9th grade range, not related to the 9th grade I experienced as a high school student in the middle 80s in Wisconsin, which could have been totally different than somebody going to high school today in Texas. So if you have children in high school today, you have an idea what they're going through, let's say in math. A lot of people would say 9th grade math is algebra. Some people would say it's geometry. Some people would say it's algebra 2. So those are open to district or state interpretations of what content is covered. But the new math standards for college and career readiness, if we go back to the blueprint, we had algebraic thinking on level E of TABE. So, algebra is introduced at all levels of TABE, and we can't just call that high school algebra anymore. So it's important to relate that if you have previous relationships with grade equivalents from TABE 9 and 10 to not automatically carry that over to 11 and 12. I have seen programs do that in some career tech programs that required a 9th grade or higher to get into the program. Well, a 9th grade on 9 and 10 is different than a 9th grade on 11 and 12 because the content standards have changed. So it might be somewhere in the 7 and 8 range. So it's better to say, to get into this career tech program, maybe we're going to only accept scale scores of 575 or higher, or something like that. And that would relate, because I looked at the blueprint, see what he covered, and I can relate that back to a scale score that's equivalent to what my program is expecting for that. So it's just an area of focus to look at and not automatically assume a 9 is the same as a 9 has been in the past, because the standards have changed quite dramatically on that. Under the resource tab, again, just real quick to point out a few other ones here. I mentioned the testing times. There is a chart for the testing times. I won't open it, but it's the same chart that we saw in the PowerPoint, so you can print that off. There is also a sample of the individual report, the new report that we had on the PowerPoint slide, so that's listed in the resource tab as well, so you have that information. I'll open up real quick at the very top of the screen our TABE to task concordance, because this was just published, and I'll scroll through it down to the pretty charts instead of going through all the narrative on it. But basically it shows green is that you're expected to pass tasks, yellow that you're marginally expected to pass tasks. So just on for those that don't know, the passing score for task is 500. So if I get a 500 on TABE 11 and 12, my expected score on task would be 509. But it could be as low as a 494 or as high as a 523. So I'm not yet in the green, I'm kind of in that yellow area. This same chart is being done for both the GED and for HiSET, so you'll see the same look of the chart, but obviously the scale scores that the GED uses, the scale scores that TABE, that HiSET uses are different, so you'll see different numbers in this chart. But basically they'll be set up the same way. The GED one is moving along right now. We're still just collecting a little bit more data. The HiSET one will happen probably early next year after we collect more data from the HiSET area. It is important to note that these correlations are being done to level D and level A of TABE. So that you'll see that correlation to those scores on both HiSET and for the GED as well. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and finish up here talking about our college placement concordance study. Many post-secondary programs use AccuPlacer, some use ACT for placement purposes, and in the past there has been concordance studies. If you go out to Google and search TABE to AccuPlacer or TABE to Compass, there are concordance studies that are from the early 2000s, and we've been asked by several states to refresh that study. So we're in the process of doing that, and that will help both adult ed students as they migrate over to post-secondary programs to eliminate some of the progress testing or placement testing. But there are programs in Kentucky, for example, the community college system uses TABE as their placement tool, so they want to have the new concordance to the new AccuPlacer test, and so we're actively doing that as well. And then, as I mentioned it earlier with our high school equivalency, and I showed you the concordance study, there are programs, and I'll point out South Carolina, for example. South Carolina just launched a new program that if you get a certain score on TABE level A, you don't have to take reading or math on the high school equivalency test. And in South Carolina, they use only TASK or the GED. So if I get a certain score on level A of reading or level A of math, I then am exempt from having to take the reading or the math portions of the GED or TASK. And that helps shorten the high school equivalency process. It reduces the cost for the student. So it allows them to, again, use content that they've previously mastered or demonstrated skill on to align to other assessments as well. New York is doing a similar program, and I know other states are looking at that. Those are state-level decisions. I know in Texas that would probably require the Board of Ed approval, but things that are being looked at in other states aligning to high school equivalency and TABE because of the college and career readiness standards as being the common theme there. That was my last slide, so I'll go ahead and leave my information up. If you are using TABE Online or the scanning system and you're having any challenges, you can always contact our support team. That 866 number is there, free of charge, free to use. Again, tabetest.com has all the resources that I've been covering today, and you can always drop me an email if you have any questions or if you'd like a copy of this PowerPoint quicker than it gets posted to the TCAL website. I'm certainly happy to send that over, but I know it's going to be posted with the webinar recording as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mike, thank you so much. I think we have a couple of questions that I wanted to revisit. One, Zanelle, it was actually your question earlier about the 5 days or the of giving the out of range test again, and that's really a TWC question, and it's a great question. And Mike, we have a new assessment policy this year where student programs can give, like, say, the reading part of the test to a student, and then they enter class, but the student must be, the testing must be complete within 5 days or 12 class hours. So I think, Zanelle, your question is a great one about if they're out of range and when do you retest. Like Mike said, you don't want to do it right away, but you're right. If they've tested and they're tired of testing, even within the 12 hours, that's a lot of testing. So I will be happy to send that question to TWC. When I get an answer, I will post it in the assessments community of practice that we have for TABE 11-12. And Zanelle, I'll be sure to send you the answer as well, because it's a great question. This is kind of a new policy for us here in the state, and perfect question. Zanelle also had another question. I'm going to read it. It's a little bit lengthy. Are we able to administer a lower level book if the student scores on the lower side of the points required to administer the second part of TABE? This will help eliminate out of range scores. For example, a student scores 6 points on, sorry, I'm scrolling up, on the language locator, a level M, should be administered based on the guide, but can we administer level E instead to ensure they don't test out of range?
Yes, and so the answer to that is yes. Just like in 9 and 10, you do have flexibility to administer a different level. If a student is at the bottom cut point on the locator, you can give them you can also look at the locator results and say, did they skip a couple of questions, and maybe that's why the locator score is at the bottom range. But you do have some flexibility on doing that. A couple of words of caution on that is if I'm using TABE Online and I'm using the automatic locator, the system is going to go by the defined cut points and place that student into those appropriate levels. So if you do want to monitor that with TABE Online, you would just not use the automatic locator in your test session. You would just use the standard locator.
Great. I think Zanelle liked that answer. Are there any other questions that I'm going to give you a few seconds to type some more questions in? I did want to mention that if you're not a part of the community of practice for assessments, it's called assessments. Go into the community of practice on the PD portal and join that community, because anytime there's new information about TABE, we post it in there. If you have any recommendations or best practices that you want to post in there, it's a good forum to do that. When the new times came out, that's where we posted it. We sent that out on the listservs and posted it in the assessments community of practice. So it's a good place to look for new information. I am going to also remind everybody, and let me see, I'm trying to, about the webinar series that Mike talked about. The link is there. Every third Thursday they do a TABE 11-12 webinar about different topics. I don't know, Mike, if you want to share what topics y'all may have covered or how that works, but you do have them recorded and housed on your website so that people that can't listen live can go back and listen to the recording, correct?
Correct, and I'll jump out there real quick. It should take just a second for that to pop up on the screen. If we go back to the TABE 11 and 12 page under resources, it's third one down from the top. It says TABE webinar series, and they are listed there. So again, we had several best practice ones that we did in December because there was a large number of enrollments. But then we've done one on TABE Online, we've done one on scanning, we've done one on curriculum, we did one looking at the diagnostic standards. We've gone down and talked about TABE Class C. We've done a webinar on the high school equivalency. And then at the very bottom, there's a link that says click here. If you're not getting the invitations, you can add your name to the email list so you can get notified when there's a new webinar that's being held for that.
Great. Thank you, Mike. That's great information. I've heard from a few people in the state who have been listening to these, and it's really helping them understand all of the nuances of the TABE 1112. So that's great.